So what was your highlight of of the plenary that we just had, really?
Well, I think what happened is that we had ended up having a lot of discussions about how the international system restricts the ability of developing countries to mobilize financing for their own development. Uh, I guess what I was trying to get across myself on my own was that perhaps our own officials themselves should be braver and to try to push the margins or the envelope in order to undertake the kinds of policies that historically worked and that could still work at the present time.
There seems to be a lot of talk about private sector and private
Yeah, yeah,
finance, but isn't that inevitable? Isn't that you can't help having finance without some sort of private
yeah,
finance?
yeah, yeah,
It's the
yeah.
control systems that.
Yeah, it's the control. Well, I think a lot of people have a mythical view of the private sector and a mythical view of the public sector, right? The public sector doesn't have enough money to undertake infrastructure, but it's always relied on the private sector to fund the infrastructure in the very first place by imposing fees, right? By owning the bridge and imposing a toll on the private sector. Now, you could make a logical argument to say that it was the private sector that funded that, but the truth is that the bridge would not be built, would not be designed, it would not be dreamed of without the public sector being involved. But in terms of the money involved, arithmetically, it's always the private sector that undertakes a lot of the infrastructure financing, but that doesn't mean that the public sector has no role, right? And which is the kind of thing that a lot of high government officials in the developed countries would like to believe, right? That the public sector would have no role at all except to probably seduce the private sector into building the bridge, right? The, the, the alternative is that the public sector decides which infrastructure projects are the priority and sells the bonds to the private sector under its own guarantee, and therefore the infrastructure project is undertaken. What has happened now is we're using a very complicated Rube Goldberg approach to financing infrastructure, right? Yeah.
Brilliant. And one sort of general question.
Yeah.
The whole conference is a thing.
Yeah.
What sort of role does this play? What does it act as, a facilitator?
Well, one thing that is happening, and I'm not, deeply involved in this, is that people are designing campaigns on specific issues. Like in our session, it's very difficult to think about it, but a campaign to provide policy space to developing countries is something. Part of it is probably a campaigning to increase the accountability of national governments in the developing countries to their own populations, right? About the economic needs for development, to protect the economic needs of development when you have a debt crisis. Now, in this group here, there's a whole group of people who are working on international debt. So that can be one way that they can take up that issue. There's a whole group here that's working on tax issues. So that's another way that then they can take up related issues with respect to policy space by developing country officials in their own policies, right? In their own implementation of policies.
How do you change the mindset of policymakers to look at it the way that you're looking at it? So
Yeah.
if they're designing policies, but the obvious thing is to borrow money.
Yeah. Well, there's a sociological underlying problem there. I don't know whether I should get into it in this interview, but let me try. In many developing countries, the finance officials and the economic policy officials do not come from a domestic constituency. Their main constituency is that they took their PhD in the United States or in the UK, right? A little bit less in the UK. And that means their constituency is the IMF and the World Bank, who are the gatekeepers of international finance, right? And therefore, they have a very difficult time even considering some of these issues like capital controls. And this is why we always make the argument, look, Iceland was able to do it. And Iceland was able to do it because they had a very active population, right? That said that, well, we will have a referendum, right? And that referendum will give a signal that we will impose capital controls, and therefore we will not be paying the creditors on time, right? We will eventually pay them, but we will not pay them on time. But a lot of the officials in the developing countries are there not because they got voted in, but they got chosen by the head of state that got voted in order to keep the IMF and the World Bank and all of the other, the United States Treasury happy about what the country is doing. Yeah?